Good afternoon. This is Kathy Neifeld, one of the four partners at Agency One. Together with Ed Lesher, Dennis Bartos, and Gonzalo Garcia, I am honored to welcome you to the final week of the 2020 Agency One annual, and we hope for this year only, virtual advisor conference. Thank you for joining us. For those of you who have joined us over the past 3 weeks, we hope you have found value from the speakers and the content that was shared. Throughout the month of October, Agency One has hosted over 20 one-hour sessions on a variety of topics, including practice management, tax policy, the economy, estate planning with high net worth clients, sales opportunities, some that are general and others that highlight a specific product, charitable planning opportunities, how you can become a shareholder in an agent-owned reinsurance company, opportunities for wealth managers that are looking for a fee-based alternative to the more traditional life insurance sales process, and much, much more. We have featured nationally recognized speakers, including estate planning attorneys from Ed Wren from Withers Bergman and David York from York, Howell and Guyman, New York Times best-selling authors and inspirational speakers Ben Nemtin, Tim Arnold from StoryBrand, and today, Kim Lear from Inlay Insights, economic and legislative updates, product specialists, sales ideas, and an underwriting update, and also our very own Gonzalo Garcia, just to name a few. During this final week, we are hosting 4 additional sessions, 2 today and 1 each on Wednesday and Thursday. They are all not to be missed and will definitely add value to your practice, including the finalists of our idea sharing contest tomorrow and our final session on Thursday, featuring the CEO of an estate, financial planning, and wealth advisory firm who has worked with some of the nation's most successful families. He will discuss new planning opportunities available in this changing economic, political, and legislative landscape. We hope you will join us for all of the remaining sessions. All of the sessions that have taken place so far have been recorded and can be accessed by you through the Attendee Hub. Hopefully, many of you that are joining us today have participated in the conference over the last 3 weeks. So I'm going to abbreviate the history of Agency One and how we got to where we are today. For those of you who have heard this before, please indulge me. We have many new advisors joining us as the upcoming session has generated a significant amount of interest. The principals of Agency One have been working together for more than 30 years, always in the life insurance brokerage space. We love what we do, and we love working with the advisors that are part of our Agency One 100 group. One of the tenets or basic value propositions that is central to our Agency One offering is providing educational content, networking opportunities, and idea sharing with our advisors. We hope we are succeeding in providing this to you in this virtual format. For those of you who have attended our conferences in the past, thank you for being with us today. For those of you who do not know us, we hope that this experience will give you some takeaways that will help you grow personally and professionally, and that it will expose you to the culture, capabilities, and professionalism of the Agency One organization and family. Once again, the entire meeting is being hosted through an Attendee Hub, where you have access to the entire agenda, live streams, virtual meeting rooms, and a virtual exhibit hall for our insurance company partners, which we hope you will visit for the final time tomorrow at 11 o'clock Eastern Time. Now, just a couple of housekeeping items. All attendees will be on mute. Please submit questions through the chat function in the Attendee Hub. This session is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be made available after the session. And please do not forget to complete the session survey after the session. Again, I would like to thank you all for joining us today, and I also want to thank Prudential for sponsoring this session. Today, we are going to talk about understanding change in generational time and how this impacts wealth and financial planning. To introduce our next speaker, I'm going to turn this over to Doug Winkler, Vice President, Independent Distribution at Prudential. Doug, take it away.
Thank you, Kathy, for that introduction, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are from. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and thank you, Agency One, Gonzalo, Ed, Dennis, and Kathy. Your partnership has meant the world to us, especially now, so thank you for that. You know, just the other day, I don't know if you saw this, but there was an article published by LIMRA and the Boston Consulting Group. It was titled, "The COVID-19 Effect, High Tech with Human Touch, Optimize the Life Insurance Customer Experience." It's a great article, and it kind of points out a couple of things that really rang true for me and why I think it's so important for us to have this conversation with Kim today. You know, for years, our business has talked about how are we going to improve the customer experience. Unfortunately, it took COVID-19 to force us to go virtual overnight. If you think about all the tools that we've had at our disposal, I mean, virtual conferencing was available, but now here we are doing it once again. And I share your sentiment, Kathy. Hopefully this will be the last Agency One virtual advisor conference that we have to do. But I know as I listen to the inventory of great ideas and provocative information that you've provided to your advisors and the folks that you work with, what a great conference. But these tools have existed. It just has accelerated the time that carriers such as us and partners that we all work with to improve things such as e-signature or accelerated underwriting. So before I introduce Kim, I often think about some of the challenges and the opportunities that are in front of us. The challenges are really pretty straightforward, right? We are in an unprecedented low interest rate environment. This is putting a lot of pressure on capital requirements. Products that were built 5 to 7 years ago were built in a different time. They were built when the Treasury was at 3%. Today it sits at around 80 basis points. They were built when a Costco AAA bond was yielding 4 or 5%. Today that bond is 1.65%. So you're seeing a lot of change that carriers have to make to current portfolios that just weren't built for today's environment. You're also seeing lots of volatility, which also causes strain and pressures on index products that many of us sell. So I think the challenges are out there, but those are just product related. As we think about some of those challenges, I'm confident that we're going to turn those into opportunities. Why? Opportunities because we are in an unprecedented period of time in our country in the demand for life insurance. Yeah, the article will point that out if you go check out the LIMRA recent article. But how to work with customers, how to engage with customers, how to understand who they are is really what we're going to be talking about now with Kim Lear. That's why I'm so happy to introduce you to her and this meeting. Just a little bit about Kim. Kim is a writer and a researcher who explores how emerging trends impact the future of our workforce and marketplace. She is known for her ability to use a mix of data, storytelling, humor, and actionable takeaways to discuss the trends that most impact the bottom line of organizations. Previously, Kim was the content director at a research firm dedicated to generational and millennial trends. Her undergrad research is around baby boomers and longevity. Her postgrad work is around millennials and social media networks. Kim has written white papers on the topics of generational wealth transfer in the finance sector, retirement trends in the hospitality industry, and Gen Z's impact on higher education. A researcher to the very core, Kim employs eye-opening statistics to accentuate her points and mixes them with stories and case studies to make her messages come alive. She's a sought-after expert and has been featured on NPR, as well as national publications such as the Wall Street Journal, the Huffington Post, USA Today, Time Magazine, and more. Kim is currently in the 5th year of a longitudinal study on leadership we got to see her at work yesterday on as we prep for this call. Ladies and gentlemen, please let me introduce you to our keynote speaker of the day, Kim Lear. Kim?
Thank you so much for having me, the Agency One team, and Doug for sponsoring. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. So I love working with financial advisors. My dad has actually been a financial advisor for about 40 years, so I do have a personal connection to the industry. I was one of the really lucky kids who got to have riveting dinner time conversations about Roth IRAs and insurance. My dad was always like, you're more likely to get hurt than die, which is why you need life insurance and disability insurance. And I was like, I'm 7. But I did have learned a lot from him over the years about what the industry is about. And then from working with different financial advisors over the past 10 years, I think the most important thing that I have learned about the industry is that for the best advisors, many of you who are here right now, the role that you play in the lives of your client is very personal. It's an intimate relationship, and you wear a lot of hats. You are part money manager, part marriage counselor, part social worker, part therapist. And so when we talk about things like generational shifts and patterns, when we talk about demographic changes, I think it's important for every industry to understand what's going on. But I would argue that it's maybe even more important for you just because the nature of that relationship is so personal. And so understanding over time how family structures change, how societal norms evolve, things like that, even more important for you. So with this presentation, I'm going to do my prepared remarks for about 45 minutes. And the prepared remarks are really meant to be more provocative, more thought-provoking. There will be some actionable takeaways, but the core of what we're trying to do with this 40 minutes is to get you to see the world through the eyes of a different generation, so that when you are working with your clients, with the children of your clients, with the grandchildren of your clients, you can have some recognition about the way that they live their lives, how that may differ and what's the same. And then during Q&A, based on your interests, we can go into some real specific takeaways then as well. So I would like to get us started on the ground level to look at who the generations are today. And some of you may be familiar with these dates. But we have our baby boomers born between 1946 and 1964, a big group of about 80 million. Then Gen X, born 1965 to 1979, a smaller group of 60 million. Millennials, born 1980 to 1995, group of 82 million. And then Generation Z, it's roughly 96 to 2010-ish. There's not really an ending date to that group quite yet. And some of you may feel like you've got one foot in one generation and one foot in another. And sometimes people who are right in the cusp feel like they're not part of the generational conversation. But actually, in the original sociology textbook on generations, there is a chapter dedicated to, it's called Cuspers. And essentially what research found is that you play an important role in communicating. You can understand both perspectives and see both sides. You may find that in the workplace or in your family, you're doing a lot of translating, a lot of mediating. So you are generationally bilingual. You can add that to your LinkedIn profile and make way more money. It's very lucrative. The other thing to know about these dates is that they're just a starting place. As you can imagine, it's not like someone goes to sleep on December 31st of one year and someone wakes up January 1st of another year and is a different species. What we're actually looking at here, the academic backbone of generational theory, is looking at events and conditions from our formative years. And our formative years, they're roughly our teenage years. And it's during this time in brain development where we're coming to terms with the world around us. So what's happening in the world at that time, it has a lasting impact on how we view things like wealth and politics, social justice. We all remember being teenagers. Some of you may be raising teenagers. So you're aware of that period of time, that teenage angst, where perhaps your whole life, your parents tell you to think a certain way, act a certain way, vote a certain way. And then you reach a stage, you decide you're going to do it your own way. And it's that period of brain development that we study how these shared experiences result in behavioral patterns and consumer trends. And generational theory is rooted in sociology, not psychology, but both are so important. And great financial advisors usually use both schools of thought in order to inform their communication styles. But psychology, it studies who you are as an individual, your unique brain, your relationship to your parents, the way you practice religion. Where sociology, we're looking at broader macro trends, demographic shifts, and evolving cultural norms. We're trying to understand why we can do something today and it's totally acceptable, but if we did it 20 years ago, it would have been wildly taboo. So as we go through this, just know that we're not trying to capture the story of one person. We're trying to capture the story of a shared culture and what that means for all of us moving forward. A simplified way to think about this is psychology seeking to answer that very important question, who am I? Or sociology, it's this question of who are we? And that is the exploration of today. So I'm going to, and forgive me, one thing that I do want to mention, just so that we're on the same page with this, is that the study of generations is not designed to encourage nostalgia for the way things used to be. The study of generations is designed to help us understand and adapt to the way things are now. I'm sure that many of you have had exposure to this topic of generations, whether it's at work or just around your dinner table. And you are aware of sometimes how quickly this can go to a negative place where people inevitably try to figure out who's right or wrong or who's better or worse. My research is objective, it's values neutral. We're not trying to figure out who's right or wrong. We're just trying to figure out what is and then how we move forward from there. So I'm going to begin with the baby boomers. And Doug mentioned my undergrad research was actually exclusively around this generation. And I'm going to spend a shorter amount of time in this presentation talking about this group, just because I know that this is, for many of you, this is probably the majority of your clients. And so I know that you have familiarity. However, different life stages, different trends start to emerge. And so during Q&A, I can go into more detail on anything around the baby boomers if you'd like. One thing that I do want to just talk about here is I want to give you an example of how this area of study is conducted, and I'll use a boomer example here. But one thing my team and I will do is we separate our focus groups by generation, and then into each focus group, we'll bring an institution or an ideology and ask that generation to talk to us about their first memory. So I'll use NASA as an example. If I walk into a baby boomer focus group and I say, tell me your first memory of NASA, most of the time baby boomers will say landing on the moon. And I ask them what that moment was like, and still to this day for many of them, their eyes get wide, this moment of incredible national pride, winning the space race, being taught that if you have the right technology, if you work hard enough, the sky's the limit, anything is possible. It was moments like this, paired with many other things that I'll talk about in a moment, that created this momentum, this youth culture of the 1960s and early 70s, this optimism and idealism. Now, if I walk next door to the Gen X focus group and I ask Gen Xers, what is your first memory of NASA? Most Gen Xers say the Challenger. And I asked Gen Xers what that moment was like, and you remembered exactly. There was a teacher on that shuttle, you never forget, you watched it in school. And Gen Xers will say to me, if we could have trusted anyone, we could have trusted the geniuses at NASA, and we were let down. It was a moment of disappointment. Just a side note, by the way, there are good things about being a Gen Xer. We just haven't talked about any of them yet, but we will. But I look for these moments of generational juxtaposition to help us understand how a new generation could come up in the world and see things a little bit differently. But for boomers, there was more of this optimism and idealism. Of course, there's so many things. I mean, we can talk about the draft in Vietnam. We can talk about Watergate. We can talk about the booming population size and some of the implications of that, the oil embargo. But one of the things that I want to talk about is things that that sometimes is not discussed enough, which is the impacts of a booming 1960s economy. So the post-World War II economy, it was booming. And by 1961, the median American man aged 25 to 29 was earning nearly 400% more than his father was earning at around the same age. So although boomers were only small children at this time, it was that economic engine that guided them into adolescence. And as baby boomers, they resisted the conformity of the 1950s, and they built new cultural norms focused on individualism and self-expression. A study of women's magazines by sociologists Francesca Kincaid and Stephen Gordon found that major themes in the 1950s were about putting family before the self. In these women's magazines in the 1950s, you would see a lot of sentiment around love means self-sacrifice and compromise. By the 1960s and 70s, putting self into the equation, sometimes putting it first, gained more popularity. And so you started seeing things like love means fulfillment, self-expression, being true to yourself. And men absorbed these cultural themes as well. The master trend in baby boomer culture was generally one of liberation. And the hallmark of boomer youth culture was elder antagonism. A prolific mantra of the time was don't trust anyone over 30. And as baby boomers become our society's elders, how they adapt and take on this responsibility will become their legacy and have broader implications for younger generations. And I think financial advisors are in an interesting position here because when we talk about legacy, right, that's so connected to the values that we have, the money that we spend, and the way that we pass down wealth. And so you're in ways that sometimes you might not even know you're really in the driver's seat of some of these changes that are happening. A couple things that I want to mention on baby boomers in terms of COVID. One is that you have a lot of baby boomers who have redefined what it means to age in this country. This mindset of 60's the new 40. And Dr. Ken Dykewald, he's a gerontologist, a psychologist, he wrote an interesting article where he talks about this collective near-death experience. And I think coming out of this, we will see across the board, but definitely with baby boomers, this real focus on legacy, on community, on philanthropy, on family. And so I'm sure some of you are already starting to see that now, but I think even coming out of this, that will be even a greater focus for your clients in that age range. And then also technology. Baby boomers, even before COVID, were showing signs of high adaptability, especially when it came to technology. Baby boomers are the generation that were most likely to own an iWatch. And I sort of lovingly joke here that it's because boomers have more money than the rest of us, but also there was just a genuine interest in what is the latest and greatest and what is new. Unfortunately, we live in a really ageist society, which tells us that anyone with gray hair is not interested in the latest and greatest. But boomers have challenged that assumption at every turn, and COVID has accelerated that trend. If we look at the National Retail Federation and we see how baby boomers, how their spending habits have changed during COVID. One of the reasons that I bring this up is because the last best experience you have anywhere becomes the minimum expectation for experiences you want everywhere. And so during COVID, as more baby boomers have become accustomed to convenience, simplicity, optimization, that will change the way that these trends exist moving forward. And so even within financial advising, when we think about conversations that this industry has had around optimization and efficiency, a lot of times those conversations are centered around the younger client, the next generation client, and what their expectations would be. I do just want to bring to the forefront that because of COVID, the expectations of everyone has changed. And so across the board, the marketplace has to ask if we're prepared for a generation of tech-empowered elders and how that will change the way money is spent and the expectations that boomers have when it comes to service. With that, I'm going to go into Gen X. So the biggest event or condition that I look at with Generation X is the emergence of 24-hour media. And MTV is an important part of the youth culture of Gen X, but even more impactful, 1980, Ted Turner put CNN on the air. And this was just the start of the 24-hour news cycle, and it changed everything. These institutions that were built by traditionalists and then improved upon by baby boomers, they were all being called into question in front of your 12-year-old eyes in your living room. So this was WorldCom and Enron, organized religion, sports, politics. During the formative years of Gen X, you remember one president saying, "I'm not a crook," and another president saying other things. And none of that was true. There was no truth to any of that. Gen Xers became very skeptical. By the time the average Gen Xer was 20 years old, you would watch 23,000 hours of television. And you couldn't binge watch anything. You couldn't fast forward through commercials. And so during your formative years, you were being sold to constantly. And advertising then doesn't have the same regulation as it does today. So this was like the Wild West of advertising. When I'm in focus groups with Gen Xers, I'll ask them to talk to me about some of the ads that they remember from their teenage years. And I think the one that comes up most often that I find hilarious is the ab roller. Some of you may remember this. It was this exercise tool that was supposed to give you a smoking hot body, but it turned out to break your back and it was recalled. There were knives that could cut through your shoes. To this day, we find that Gen Xers show an aversion to traditional sales tactics. When we measure their brand loyalty, they prove to be an unforgiving segment. If you lie to them, if you cross them one time, it's hard to bring them back into the fold. So that skepticism is part of what we see with Gen X. But it wasn't just these institutions being called into question on television. There was also the institution of marriage being called into question on the home front. And during the Gen X birth years, the US divorce rate doubled. So you've got a generation of kids who come home to empty homes. Either both parents are working or parents are divorced. And so Gen Xers, they let themselves off the school bus, let themselves in the door, put their own food in the microwave, did their own homework, organized their own time. To this day, we find that Gen Xers have this streak of fierce independence. And this impacts the workplace. Even now, I'll ask Gen Xers, how do you want to work? And they'll say things like, tell me what you want, where you want it, when you want it, how you want it. I'm going to go away. And hopefully you are about to go away. And then we can get it done. So overall, some of these trends that we see with Gen X and things to remember, and I want to make sure that this is clear, these are trends and not traits. So I'm not saying that everyone born between this date and this date is this. We're looking at observable behavior in longitudinal studies. And it was during this time where we started to see a rapid increase in consumer and employee skepticism, a more focus on independence and independent contribution. This is the most entrepreneurial generation. 55% of startup founders fall into the Gen X category. And you think about that, it makes sense. You've got a generation of kids who don't really trust the system, and they taught themselves how to work outside of it. This combination of skepticism, independence, and entrepreneurial spirit, it impacts many different aspects of our society, things that we don't always think about. But Gen Xers, they're the generation of parents most likely to homeschool their children for non-religious purposes. And you think about some of that skepticism against the public school system, and then that independent entrepreneurial spirit taking that into their own hands. What does this mean for you as advisors? I think the skepticism probably plays the biggest role in communication. We find Gen Xers almost have this fairly specific style of communication, honest, direct, unfiltered. And so thinking about how you prepare, how you anticipate and prepare for skepticism. Oftentimes, this is the generation of clients and consumers where they'll do all of their own research and they know everything about you before you even open your mouth. And so thinking through in the whatever it is that I'm about to talk to a client about, what are the holes that they could poke in this? What is the cultural conversation around our industry right now? What are some things that this client may have read before coming in here that I can proactively address for them to let them know that I understand where their skepticism is coming from, and I'm prepared to answer some of those more difficult questions. And the skepticism, it's also changed the relationship between the person in need of expertise and the expert themselves. And an easy place to look at this is in the healthcare system. If we think about the traditional doctor-patient relationship, it used to be that doctors were essentially oracles, and whatever they said, that's what we did. Now, as even patients have become more skeptical, people want to be in the driver's seat of their own healthcare. And I was doing a project for St. Luke's Medical, and one of the doctors there sent me a picture of a mug that he purchased, which says, "Please do not confuse your Google search with my medical degree." And I think this is how a lot of experts may feel today. When you have a more aggressive client with some of this raised skepticism, it can be easy to get defensive and say things like, "This is my job, right? This is what I've always done. You should just trust me." But oftentimes it's the fastest way to lose the trust of a skeptical person. Instead, it's saying something like, "I appreciate how engaged you are in this process. Let me see what you've got. Show me your information. Let's go through this together, and let me be a resource for you. Let me curate this so we can really uncover what is real within this." The last thing I want to talk about with baby boomers, with Gen Xers, has to do with the implications of COVID. And this is actually related to their life stage. So since 1980, every group of middle-aged Americans have been referred to as the sandwich generation. And it's referring to this life stage where you're caring for aging parents on one side and you're taking care of school-aged children on the other side. Take COVID out of this just for a moment. I already thought that Gen Xers were in a particularly precarious situation with this life stage because the illnesses of their parents are chronic, are very time consuming, and extremely expensive. On the other side, with their children, they're the first generation of parents to navigate the teenage years with social media. So there were already difficulties here. Now we put COVID on top of this. We've got elder vulnerability. And so we have a lot of Gen Xers trying to figure out, how do I best care for my parents right now? What's safe? What should my exposure really be? If they are in some type of assisted living housing, do I want to keep them there? Do I want to take them out? And then on the other side, with their children, dealing with kind of the mental health crisis that is impacting teenagers right now, dealing with distance learning, homeschooling, all of that. The reason that I bring this up, of course, is because, again, in the spirit of trying to see the world through the eyes of a different generation, I think we need to understand from a life stage perspective where Gen Xers are at right now and what they're trying to balance. They are also in the midst of their prime earning years. And so on top of all of this, they're also trying to make their top salaries. And so how you show up for them, aware of their behavioral health, the ways that you can try in any way that you can to offer them some peace of mind, to create more efficiencies so that they can get some of their time back. All of those things can go a long way as Gen Xers navigate this already difficult situation, which has become more difficult in the midst of COVID. With that, I'm going to go into the millennials. So I'm not going to talk about the economic backdrop of millennials right now, only because that brings us into a bit of a different conversation. And for the sake of time, I want to focus on other areas. When I ask millennials about the events and conditions that have shaped their generation, the responses typically fall into one of two categories. One has to do with technology, and the other has to do with how violence was experienced. I'm going to start with tech, because it was during our formative years where the internet went social. And we grew up in this living, breathing Rolodex of social media, which gave an ROI to word of mouth, which is one of the reasons why companies have been so millennial obsessed for so long. But social media usage is one of the main differentiators between millennials and Gen Z. For millennials, there was a distinct optimism around the possibilities of this new type of technology. This was Occupy Wall Street. This was the Arab Spring. The Facebook, so the collegiate version that came out first, it was ad-free and it was adult-free. And so millennials growing up, we didn't know that we were the product, and we weren't worried about employers or parents seeing the content that we put out. And I'll just give you a sort of a stupid example of this, but I'm in a group text chat with a bunch of my girlfriends from college. And one of my girlfriends, she's got 2 kids. She has an MBA from a fancy school. She's very accomplished, has a great job. And she had watched The Social Dilemma, which I'm sure many of you have watched, which is just about the nature of social media and how it can negatively impact individuals and society. So she watches this documentary and she decides to scrub her social media. So she goes on Facebook, which she hasn't been on in years. And this mother, this businesswoman, she looks at the photo albums that she had uploaded during college. So again, college, this was like 15 years ago. And she only had 2 photo albums. And the first one, the name of the photo album was called Binge Drinking. And the second one was called Binge Drinking Part 2. So of course, all of my girlfriends, we are making fun of her endlessly, because not only is that so stupid, but it's also not creative. It's like, if you're going to be stupid, at least try to be creative with it. But the reason that I bring that up is because you can just see how there was less intentionality and fewer consequences in the early days of Facebook. And that still really impacts the millennial imagination around some of these pieces of technology. It was more of a scrapbook of your friends for your friends rather than an exercise in personal branding, where all people today, but especially young people, Gen Zers, they can create permanent identities based on temporary stages, which I think is really transformational, which is something we can talk about during Q&A if you're interested. So that early version of social media, millennials' ability to influence and be influenced, and some of that innate trust in technology are some of the things that we study when we look at millennials. The other side, of course, is violence. And every generation had more than their fair share of violence. With the millennials, we look at the beginnings of the desks next to us. This is Virginia Tech, Oklahoma City, Columbine, and of course, 9/11. There are many psychological studies that have been done to try to understand how this interaction with violence at a young age impacts the psyche of youth. But one area that it impacted that sometimes we forget about is how this impacted our public education system. So after Columbine, there was an influx of money that went into school for things like guidance counselors. And these guidance counselors were not there to get you out of biology. They were trained in trauma. There was a recognition among the Department of Education that there were 12-year-olds who were scared to go to school, and there were parents who were scared to send them, and they needed some type of institutional response. So you think about the implications of that, 82 million young people coming through a school system that had fundamentally changed. Adults are there to work with you, not against you. And you have people telling you to speak up, that your voice matters. And this funneled outside of the school system. So it wasn't just teachers and guidance counselors. It was priests and rabbis and coaches and mentors, but no one was doing this more than baby boomer parents. Baby boomer parents and millennial children have a notoriously close relationship. And one of the reasons for that is this backdrop of violence, creating a cultural moment where parents felt like they needed to hold their kids a little bit closer. Another reason for this closeness is that many baby boomers wanted to have relationships with their children that they typically did not have with their own parents. When I'm in focus groups with baby boomers, I'll ask them, tell me what are some things you could not talk to your parents about? And they either all say sex in unison or they say nothing because they still can't talk about it. But when I ask them to reflect on their relationship with their own children, they talk about the openness of those relationships. And so the family structure in the 1980s in many ways fundamentally changed to this more collaborative family structure. As a result of some of these cultural changes, we see a generation, some of the trends, social media at its core is a collaborative technology. A more collaborative family structure started emerging in the 1980s. I do work in the K through 12 facilities, and it was during the formative years of millennials where we moved from a traditional lecture style to sitting in groups of 4. Some of you, if anyone is around my age, you'll remember this. And the reigning research at the time said that if you put kids together in this configuration, they'll have better conflict resolution skills, they'll be better collaborators, and in many ways, that's what happened. Empowered, networked, risk-averse, in search of meaning. Risk aversion is measured by entrepreneurial rates, which are low, and investment patterns, which are overly cautious for their age. So we can talk more during Q&A about risk aversion and some of the impacts. One piece here that I want to talk about with millennials has to do with their life stage. Because right now we've got about half of millennials in this phase known as emerging adulthood, which is referring to young people getting married later, having children later, buying homes later. And then we have about half of millennials who have purchased homes and have gotten married and have kids. I'm going to talk about millennial families, but during Q&A, if you'd like to discuss emerging adulthood, I'm happy to do so. One quick comment I want to make is with millennial families, the main piece I'm going to talk about is the rise of dual income households. And the secondary research available to me is only on heterosexual couples, but I recognize that there are many different ways to create a family. So in 1960, 25% of households were dual income. And by 2018, that was 66% of households. And I use a picture of Jay-Z and Beyonce just because I'm sure we can all all kind of connect to that type of earning potential. One thing that happened is that as women started contributing more financially to the home front, men started contributing more domestically. In 1965, fathers spent 6.5 hours per week on household work and childcare, and by 2018, that number jumped to 18 hours per week. I think one of my favorite things that happened in a live presentation is I showed this slide and a woman in the front yelled out, "Well, is this self-reported?" And I was like, yes, this is self-reported. I'm not allowed to move into people's homes and follow the dad around to decide about his parental involvement. But we do see that there's been more of an involvement. We see this even in the push for paternity leave within organizations. And this isn't at all to say that one generation of fathers was good and one is bad. It's just that the social construction of fatherhood has changed the way the social construction of everything changes. And just a personal example, my dad, who I'm very close with, I distinctly remember when he came to the pediatrician with my mom and me when I was like 6, and I was convinced I was dying because I don't know why my dad was at the pediatrician. That was very strange in the 1980s, where now we start seeing that as more baseline expectation. I bring this up for financial advisors for a few reasons. One is that the industry has worked for the last decade on how to be better for women, how to speak to female clients, how to bring in female advisors. And to be honest, I think the industry's still got a very long way to go on that. But femininity and masculinity are two sides of the same coin. As one changes, the other follows suit. And so I would also argue that in addition to better connecting with women, there's also this question of how do we better connect with a new generation of young men? What is it that is deemed aspirational today? I remember last year I was conducting some interviews with advisors, and one of these advisors told me, he said, I've got these young clients and such high earners, and the guy was just offered this incredible job opportunity. They were going to be set for life. And he turned the job down because the commute was too long. There was too much travel. He was going to be away from his kids too much. And the advisor was so confused on how a decision like that could have been made, especially because the financial gains on the other side of that promotion were really pretty astronomical. But without understanding family aspirations today, it's hard to really understand how people want to organize their lives, what egalitarian marriages really look like. And again, during Q&A, I can go into a little bit more detail on this. I would say that the best researcher on this topic is at Northwestern. Eli Finkel wrote a book called The All or Nothing Marriage, which is the most comprehensive study of marriage, how it's changed, what it looks like today, what it means for the economy, and what it means for families. Last thing that I do want to talk about here is with COVID. We've got millennials who are in some of the most vulnerable categories when it comes to this pandemic, because we've got millions of millennials with young children at home in the midst of school closures, daycare closures, with limited options for childcare, and with both parents working. Just from a behavioral health standpoint, we're seeing a lot of issues. And then a lot of young people in this phase of emerging adulthood. We have millions of millennials in this country who are going through this pandemic alone, isolated, especially in urban centers. And so, I bring this up to you as financial advisors, one, just to get a better sense of what are people going through? How are they handling this pandemic? What is their life like at this time? And also thinking about the ways in which you can connect with them, provide them a sense of community, camaraderie, and peace of mind throughout this. Again, that I can address that in more detail during Q&A. With that, I'm going to go into Gen Z, and then we will open it up. So in all of my interviews and focus groups, I ask the question, many years from now, a historian will write a book about your generation. They'll write a book about this time. what are the cultural touch points? What are the events and conditions you think they'll talk about when we talk about your generation? The main ones that I hear about from Gen Z are the Clinton-Trump campaigns, both of those campaigns, Trump's presidency, the Me Too movement, global climate change, social media, specifically Instagram and TikTok, school shootings, specifically Parkland and Newtown, the Unite the Right March, and Black Lives Matter. Part of my job is to hear from people, thousands of people, about the events and conditions that they feel are shaping their generation. And part of my job is to uncover glaring omissions. For Generation Z, the glaring omission is growing up with the backdrop of an uneven economic recovery from the 2008-2009 housing crisis and growing inequality. A fish doesn't know it's in water, and these deep disparities and growing inequality have simply become the background hum of our modern era. There are a lot of ways that we can think about this, but I'm just going to focus on the prevalence of a managed childhood and the competitive nature of adolescence. I bring this up to many of you because I know that you're working with high net worth families, and this is more prevalent among the upper middle class and the ultra wealthy. So I thought it would be particularly relevant to you. In a recent interview with a parent, he said, with a Gen X parent, he said, the crazy train had already left the station. The other parents were getting private coaches for their kids, and I wasn't going to deprive my daughter of a top spot and the chance to play college soccer simply out of principle. And as with many parent interviews I've conducted over the past 10 years, there's an air of, I know I shouldn't, but. It's almost as if our principles and our parenting must remain separate in order to raise the right kind of kids for our modern workforce. Many Gen Xers who I interview, they have this like visceral response when I talk about that, when they talk about what they deem as the classic baby boomer parent millennial child relationship. And they share deep disdain for helicopter parenting and the self-esteem movement. So my follow-up question is, tell me about a time when you let your kid fail intentionally. They were going to bomb a test, you saw that they weren't studying, and you were just going to let them handle the consequences. And the answers are what you would expect. Some parents chuckle at the realization of their own hypocrisy, or they'll share a story with me, and halfway through they realize that they're actually sharing a story about a time when they put a glass floor under their child. I make no judgment here. This makes all the sense in the world to me. The price for failure today is higher than it was for past generations of adolescents. There is this growing awareness just beneath the surface that good jobs are getting better, middle jobs are disappearing, and bad jobs are getting worse. And the economists Richard Reeves and Tyler Cohen are probably the ones who have showcased this change with the most comprehensive data. And this isn't a bunch of crazy parents who are pulling this idea out of thin air. While the number of applicants to four-year colleges and universities have doubled since the 1970s, available slots have changed very little. And economists use the term absolute income mobility to describe the relation of one generation's earning to another. For Americans born in 1940, they had approximately a 90% chance of out-earning their parents. For millennials, the mobility number is 50%, and it's expected to be lower for Gen Z. So we have this strange combination of a very competitive generation, yet also risk averse. When the price for failure is higher, there is more at stake. So young people today are less likely to get a driver's license, less likely to do drugs, to have sex, less likely to drink alcohol. And so, having a competitive generation typically represents something that could be really good for the economy, great for the workforce, but risk aversion, because of its impact on entrepreneurial rates, is bad for the economy. And so we have this mix, which again, during Q&A, we can go into more detail, but I think that will be something to keep an eye on as we look at the next generation's behavior in the marketplace and workplace. The last thing that I want to talk about is this conversation around the evolving role of employers in matters of social justice. My research around this topic started back as Me Too was cresting back in 2018. But of course, in the midst of George Floyd's murder, this is a renewed urgency. One thing just that I want to bring up is that this study around employer and CEO activism isn't new just to this exact moment. Some of you may recall that back in 2018, Harvard Business Review did start a big study on this topic. And Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, he contributed to some of the research, and he says, CEO activism is not a leadership choice, but a modern and an evolving expectation. CEOs have to realize that millennials are coming into the organization and expecting the CEO to publicly represent the values of that organization. He says millennials, I would actually argue more Gen Z. And we've seen this before. After the Parkland shooting, the CEO of Dick's Sporting Goods made some kind of moral decisions based in his morality. In terms of how this impacts the workplace, and I do just want to point out that this isn't a right or left thing, right? We see organizations on both sides kind of putting a stake in the ground around certain moral issues. And there was this tweet that went viral over the summer that says the revolution will not be diversity and inclusion trainings. And the reason that I show this is I think that this tapped into some of the zeitgeist, not only in that moment, but kind of an ongoing conversation around what does equality really look like? What is equitable? And I think organizations, employers, CEOs, community leaders are all kind of grappling with this at this moment. And there is this internal pressure that companies are facing as we see more employee activism, but then there's also that external pressure as we see more conscious capitalism. There's this Chrome extension called Progressive Shopper, which some of you may have seen. This is for the right, but for the left, but there's one for conservatives as well. And what this is when you go, it's an extension that you can put into your browser. And when you go to make a purchase, it can tell you a little bit about where that organization donates their money. If you click on serious issues, it can give you diversity and inclusion numbers. It can tell you if there have been any sexual harassment cases that you may want to know about. So what does all this mean? For one thing, conscious capitalism, people have always wanted to put their money where their mouth is. Now, because of technology and increased transparency, it's just easier to do that. But in almost kind of a more philosophical way, I think it's going to be interesting that as historians pontificate on this cultural moment, I think a question that they will ask themselves is, why are for-profit corporations being called upon to serve as moral stewards for society? What does that tell us about our other institutions that this is who society is crying out to in this time? And so I think, that will just kind of be more of that philosophical question that we can only answer, 50, 100 years down the road. I bring this up though, because I know that many of you work on, wealth changing hands and some of the shifts in values and things like that. And across the board, even before this summer, I was definitely seeing more of this activism coming from the younger generations. I was conducting the interviews at Google when they had big walkouts over the mishandling of a sexual harassment case. I've worked with Patagonia as they have seen their consumer numbers increase dramatically as they made even more environmental decisions. And so as you think about money, as you think about wealth, as you think about values, which are all so intertwined, I think having some recognition around where we are in this current moment, what employers are dealing with as they respond to marketplace demands for this moral stewardship. With that, I'm going to open it up for questions. And I'll hand it over to you, Kathy.
Kim, thank you. That was fascinating. And we do have a number of questions. And, you ended, or your part of your conclusory statements were talked about wealth management, so to speak, and the wealth advisor. And a question that came in which specifically addresses that, which is, there are a lot of statistics on wealth managers being fired at the death of their client by the next generation. What can advisors do with the information that you have presented to retain the assets generationally? So what is it that they should be focusing on?
Yep. One is just making that connection very early. Because one of the things that happens that with advisors that I've worked with is the client may get sick or even sometimes pass away. And only then does the advisor realize that they haven't really communicated often with the kids, and the kid might have an advisor already, or they married someone who had an advisor and now they're working with that person's advisor. And so part of it is, making that connection really early on, uncovering what it is that's important to that person. I think having, when I talk to young inheritors of wealth, one of the things that they say when they feel like there are some of these big generational disconnects is regarding that family structure, understanding what family aspirations are today. And so I think even just being cognizant of that, of understanding what does a successful life look like to you and your family? What are you trying to accomplish? What are the career aspirations for both of you that I can help you meet? And I'll give you just again, kind of a stupid example, but an advisor that my husband and I used to work with, as we were going through my entire financial plan, I was pregnant with my second kid at that time. And he said, maybe we should write out this plan as if it's one income, insinuating that after I had my second kid, then I would probably stop working. And I've been working since I was 15 years old. I was like, why would I stop working after having my second kid? But the advisor is older and had a more traditional family structure that made him really happy. And I think he was really confused on, how this would look going forward. And it was just this big gap in understanding. And so it's little things like that, right? Making these assumptions that are really no longer reflective of people's reality anymore. And then, of course, in terms of the social justice piece, just understanding what is the impact you want to have with this money and how can I help you reach that? I think those are all good ways to better connect with a new generation.
So following up on what you just said, for that specific advisor for you, did that cause you to question whether or not you were working with the right advisor for your family at that time?
We did end up going with a different advisor, and it's everyone can be forgiven for a mistake. You know what I mean? He's not a bad guy. It was a series of things that just kind of showed this real disconnect between the life that my husband and I are trying to build, and kind of his view of the world.
Thank you. We've got a number of other questions. I also want to encourage folks that if they've got any questions, so please type them into the chat function. Another question that came in was related back to the story of your friend from college and Facebook and that story. And the question is, what is the best way for us to get through to our children to impose upon them the importance of not creating a permanent record for a temporary moment?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. That's the $1 million question, isn't it? I mean, I've got two, little ones right now, and I'm already like, oh my God, I'm never giving them technology. I mean, here's the thing is that I think instead of trying to force adolescents who don't have a fully formed frontal lobe to behave like adults, I think we need to revisit our type of technology and our norms around it. I think that also we perhaps should not be holding teenagers accountable in certain respects for some of the things that they post in these like adolescent moments of trial and error. So, I think it's a broader conversation around what does societal forgiveness look like? If all of us, if our entire adolescence was recorded, there would be things that all of us regret saying, ideas that we regret having, things that we regret communicating. And this is what I mean when I say that adolescence today is higher stakes, because it's recorded. And so their missteps can impact them for the rest of their life. So a bigger conversation is around societal forgiveness. I would say parental to-dos. In the follow-up material that I send out, there are 2 podcasts that I would recommend listening to they're with child psychologists who are more better than I to provide like parenting advice. But I think it's really open and honest conversations around permanent records, around permanent identities and temporary phases. It's just a lot of open communication between parents and kids. But I'll send along those 2 podcasts.
Thank you. Uh, you had mentioned that Generation Z may be even more risk adverse than millennials. And I think that we all know folks that have children that haven't gotten that driver's license and haven't achieved the milestones that I'm older than you are, but from my generation, it was like I couldn't wait to get the driver's license. I couldn't wait to move out of my parents' house. I couldn't wait to become independent. And you talk about risk aversion. What are the implications for this youthful risk aversion?
One thing on the hunger for independence that I just want to bring up that actually is kind of a silver lining is that back in 2016, Sparks and Honey, which is a great research firm in New York, they found that 58% of teens say their parents are their best friends. And I can send along some of the theories as to why that's happening. But I do actually think that one of the reasons that there isn't this urgency to get out of the house is because of this family formation, this friendship-like relationship between Gen X parents and their Gen Z kids. And that can actually really be seen as kind of a positive. The risk aversion, though, is very much related to what we just talked about in terms of this permanent record. When I conduct interviews with Gen Zers, which I have done hundreds, I'll ask them, what are your opinions about X, Y, and Z? Some of these cultural things. And overwhelmingly, they will say things like, well, I don't know everything about that, and so I'm not going to say anything. A pro is that's great that we have people who want to do research and figure things out and not form an opinion until they're well informed. On sort of this like unintended consequence side is that oftentimes what helps solidify someone's opinion is openly discussing it, putting it into this quote unquote marketplace of ideas. And so if you have a lot of young people who are too risk averse, too scared to put these ideas out there, to debate them, to have this intellectual conversation around them, it can result in just not fully formed ideas. That's not good for anyone. And then just in general, risk aversion is usually never good for the economy because of what it does to entrepreneurship rates and what it does to innovation. If people feel like the consequences for failure are greater than the rewards for success, they won't try anything new. And that's something that we'll have to grapple with, is how do we create a culture of innovation in the midst of so much risk aversion?
Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions. It's just a little bit past 1 o'clock. So let's talk about the role of corporations in the matters of social justice. And what's the real risk if a company stays quiet about social justice?
I think something that some of you may be familiar with Coinbase's decision. Coinbase is a blockchain technology out in Silicon Valley, and their CEO just made this like big proclamation around, we're going to keep everything political, every social justice thing. Do not talk about it. There's no place for it in the workplace. And I think that he accidentally thought that would communicate neutrality, when in fact silence in itself is actually a stake in the ground. And so we don't know exactly what the price is, and it's going to be dependent on how much Gen Z actually takes seriously what they're talking about right now with conscious capitalism. But I do think that we will see a growing price for silence. I don't think it will be seen as neutrality in the future. I think it will be seen as complacency. And so that's kind of what that risk is that there is a risk. It's hard to measure right now, but I think we'll start to see more of its marketplace effects as Gen Z starts to control more money.
Okay, and I hope you're going to indulge me because another question came in, so we're going to have 2 more. I'm going to add 1 more, if that's okay.
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, if you could give one piece of advice relative to this conversation to a wealth manager or financial advisor or risk management advisor, what would it be for them to continue to remain relevant?
Um, don't hold on too tightly to sacred cows. Um, don't give in to generational hazing, which, sorry, so I'm giving a couple, but there's always been, there's a famous quote from 8th century BC from Hesiod where he says, "I see no hope for the future if we're dependent on the frivolous youth of today." And so there's a generational hazing that's always been a part of our cultural narrative. I think that that's a very quick slide into irrelevancy. Stay connected to your clients, the children of your clients, and be open to their new ideas of looking at things. And I think do what so many of you probably already do because you're great financial advisors, which is in an open-minded, non-judgmental way, hearing people, understanding their values, and staying connected to how you can help them reach their goals, even if those goals are different than your own.
What are you hearing in your interviews that's making you hopeful about the future?
Oh, a lot. And just so all of you know, since March 13th, I've been doing, my team and I, we've so far conducted 250 one-on-one interviews with people of every generation, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different races, different ethnicities, different ends of the political spectrum. And it's all for the study on creating a time capsule of a pandemic, understanding how people are living during this time. And so I'll tell you what makes me most hopeful is that early on in the pandemic, there was a lot of conversation around this awakening to life's simple pleasures that people were saying things like, as long as I have my health and I have my family, I've really realized that's all I need. And because of Maslow's hierarchy, obviously there's some truth to that. But I would say that rolling into the 8th month of this pandemic, actually what we're seeing is the limitations of those things. I think much more so than being awakened to life's simple pleasures. I think we are being awakened to the importance of communal life. In all of my interviews, I ask people, let's say a vaccine comes out tomorrow and we take it and we're all good, the pandemic is behind us. What's the first thing you want to go do? And people want to go to concerts and they want to go out to dinner and they want to go to a crowded bar where someone spills a drink on them and they want to take their mom out to dinner and they want to be out in the world. I think something that makes me so hopeful is that in this moment, we're connected to this primitive nature that we have where we are clans people, we are tribes people, we belong together and we miss each other. And I think that makes me hopeful about almost a renaissance when this is done. Where we are reconnected and a growing appreciation for communal life.
That's optimistic. I would like to see all of that as well, to be perfectly honest with you. I think we all would. 2 more questions, if I might. And this is interesting. Why do some very wealthy parents not want to transfer wealth to their children? And obviously, there are circumstances that are very specific to an individual family. But I think that if we broaden that from one generation to the next and kind of like the what's important to one generation versus another generation, how do you see that as it relates to transferring wealth and the reluctance to do that? If you do at all.
I feel like some of you on this call could probably answer this even better than I do because you are, I'm sure, are dealing with this. You've dealt with this on many different occasions over your career. So I'm sure that you have best practices. And it's things that I mean, when people inherit money that they feel like perhaps they don't deserve, that they didn't work for, I think that can bring a lot of unhappiness. And in a conversation that I had just with Kathy yesterday, she was talking about how One of the conversations that Agency One has and that a lot of financial advisors have is how do we prepare this wealth for the next generation? But then there's this such bigger conversation that needs to be had around how do we prepare the next generation to inherit wealth? How do you do that in a way that's responsible, that doesn't take away your ambitions, that doesn't take away the impact that you want to make, that you're not so ridden with guilt in a meritocracy that you are paralyzed? And so maybe some parents just want to alleviate that for their children, and they want them to, feel like maybe they stood on their own 2 feet in certain ways. But again, I feel like some of you could answer that even better than I could.
I think it all starts and stops with a value proposition.
Yeah.
And in any event. And then thank you. The last question, which probably should be the easiest one for you to answer, is where can we find more of Kim's work?
Oh, that's so I'm going to send out actually a summary of this presentation, a recommended reading list. The best place to see my recent research is actually on my newsletter, because I'm not really a big user of social media. So I think for now, the newsletter is a good place to start. And I'll send you information on where to sign up for that. And yeah, that's, I've also, for some of you who are members of AALU and Gamma, I've done a lot of work for them. They have a commissioned proprietary white paper that it's a 15-page white paper, a comprehensive study of my 250 interviews during COVID. So do that. And always feel free to reach out to me. Anyone can reach out with any questions. I'm happy to provide any insight that would be helpful.
Thank you, Kim. You've been extremely generous with your time. This session has been extremely valuable, and I hope that the advisors that have joined us learn something and can apply it to their practice. I also want to thank Prudential for sponsoring this session. A few housekeeping items as we're going to wrap up. Number one, please remember to fill out your surveys. They will be emailed to you sometime this afternoon. And later today at 3 o'clock, we are going to have a workshop that is specifically designed for wealth managers that are looking for a fee-based alternative to traditional life insurance products. We hope you will join us at 3 o'clock today for that session. Thank you for your participation, and please reach out to Agency One if we can be of any assistance. I hope everyone has a nice afternoon. Take care. Kim, thank you again.
Thank you.
That concludes the session for